Welcome, Ben. Wonderful to be in dialogue with you today. This is, in many ways, a conversation on the future of activism. It's something that I've been looking forward to and imagining for some time, and I'm hoping that this could be part of the first of a series. Perhaps we can do a part two and a three. I was grappling with for the past maybe year or so who to explore this with, in a really nuanced way. And I like to have an open, honest, provocative, perhaps, and nuanced dialogue about the future of activism, its potential, the practices, how arts fits into that ethos, and also the blind spots. And given your creative work, your strategic work, your activism, your thinking, all of that, I'm sure we'll get into some really juicy angles. So before we get going, though, I first want to acknowledge that today I'm speaking from unceded, unsurrendered, and occupied Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory, what is colonially known as Ottawa, Canada. I'm a first-generation immigrant to this land. My parents moved from India when I was about 9 years old, and acknowledging that territory has become really important for me as part of my own journey, and locating and grounding myself to be present to the privileges I have as a first-generation settler. So, welcome, Ben. How are you feeling today?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on the show.
Okay, super. Let's dive in. And this is, we don't have a ton of time, so I wanted to have folks learn about your story, and that, I suppose, is the first question for me, is what's your story? You're a world-renowned artist and activist. You say the mission of your work is to make positive impact unforgettable. I've seen your audacious installations and illustrations. They really are unforgettable. They're imaginative, they're compelling, they're jarring, eye-opening, and the engineer in me loves them because the material innovation is brilliant, and mechanically they're designed beautifully. So give us some insight into your journey, your story, and perhaps also your inspirations and your dreams.
All right, how to do that quickly. So I am actually originally Canadian, and was sorry. So yeah, I'm originally Canadian, currently living in the United States, and my work began as a hard rock mining engineer. I studied at McGill University, and when I was younger, I never had a bone of activism necessarily in me. I just started off thinking that university is what you did after, high school, and just was on that treadmill of just getting an education, getting a job, seeing where I would end up. And somehow in that journey, picked up photography as a hobby. And to my great surprise, photography was one of those hobbies that actually stuck. I think it's because I found community. I was at the right place at the right time. It was a skill set that requires this supportive technology in order to execute. So it's not like a paintbrush where you really just need to learn how to use that paintbrush. And I think that sort of collaborative, pro-social nature of photography, where you're constantly working with other people to photograph them, was what really drew me to that art form. And so fast forward, working as a hard rock mining engineer for 3.5 years, doing photography on the evenings and weekends, I eventually woke up one morning and I'm like, okay, I don't know what I want to do in life, but I know exactly what I don't want to do. And that's work at a bigger desk in 10 years, earning a little bit more money, doing somewhat a variant of the same thing. Right. And so I ended up quitting that day job and just seeing what art could offer. But I think in my mind, when I took this sabbatical initially, it was really meant to be a sabbatical. It wasn't a career path pivot. And somehow we're 10 years into the future now, and that sabbatical turned into a full-fledged career. My brush with activism started a little bit later, maybe 2.5 years, 3 years after quitting my day job. I had created a number of photography campaigns that had gone viral, from tying models underwater in a shipwreck in Bali while I was on vacation. And at the time, I think this was right at the generation of clickbait, where clickbait headlines were really popular. And YouTube videos were just starting to get mainstream recognition. And I
Right.
rode that wave by doing a series of different stunts that got me on the front of different newspapers, which eventually grew and culminated into a commercial photography career. But I think very quickly, as I was starting to earn larger sums of money from corporate campaigns, started to realize that this was not actually something that motivated me. It felt kind of empty. And thus began the journey to figure out, how do you combine fantasy and impact together? How do you create stories that can help move narratives forward? And so sometime in 2016, took another sabbatical, but this time I was like, all right, we're not going to take any commercial work. We're just going to focus on impact. But I didn't really know what impact was. So I had to like sort of dive into that world, watch a bunch of documentaries, try to find people that wanted to collaborate with me, especially because I was coming at it from a completely different angle. And that's how I slowly but surely stumbled across the environmental movement and started interpreting all these sort of like issues that require essentially the compression of time into a single moment, and trying to translate that into emotions in a compelling way. And so now I've since shifted from doing photography to temporary art installations to then more permanent art installations, and now these pieces have sort of grown in both scale and scope, and ambition, and that's kind of where I'm at right now. So
Right.
hopefully that
And
summarizes a little bit the
yeah,
journey.
yeah. I mean, there's so many, twists and turns that you've taken. In many ways, your journey tracks, resonate with me in my own journey, starting my career as an aerospace engineer, and going through my own sort of realizations and reflections and introspections and all of that, and ending up where I'm at today at the Future of Good. Um, this is a question that I'm really curious about, and I find that folks around me have causes that they've cared about since they were kids, and for and they sort of wrap their careers and their passions around that cause. And so, in all of these twists and turns, and we sort of like look back, was there a cause that you were like, this is a cause that I'm deeply passionate about? I know a lot of your work now is focused on planetary boundaries and environment and so on. But was that always the case? Like, was that a cause you always cared about, or was there something else, another cause that you were deeply passionate about?
Yeah, when I look back at my childhood, I was really big into fantasy and sci-fi novels. I was just
Wow.
like a big fiction nerd, and I didn't really have, I think, a cause that really spoke to me, that was coming from a place of like, oh, I love this thing, I want to protect it, I want to nurture it, I want to see it thrive. But rather, maybe it's more the abstract concept of like honor and duty and doing the right thing and saving the world, right? Like I think like we
Right.
all want, maybe little boys growing up, seeing yourself as like a character in Star Wars with a lightsaber or something, like you want to be like the hero that comes and saves the day. I think that broader construct is what I was pursuing as a child, and as I grew up, I mean, the world's a complicated place, and so it was never really clear how you bridge the gap between fantasy and reality.
Mm.
But I guess as I somewhat like grew in my art and my ability to reach people, there was always this question of like, oh, is it possible to use these talents and skills for good? And as I pivoted from, I guess, being an influencer that was inspiring people to pursue their passions, into someone who is like really trying to utilize the art itself to create change in the world, a lot of my early day activism actually came much more from a place of duty. So like, this is the right thing to do. I have a skill set and some power and some ability to connect with people. How can I convert that into something positive? But I think the challenge with that, as like now fast forward like almost a decade into the future, is that like
Right.
coming at things from a place of duty actually feels much more like a burden. Like it's like something you're shouldering as like, oh, I have to do this, otherwise I will be a bad person, or something to that effect. And it ends up feeling quite heavy. And over the last couple years, I've actually been on a sort of reverse track where I've been trying to to come at my activism from a place of love. And so that requires first falling in love and understanding. And so I've been taking much more time to learn more about the very thing I'm trying to protect, but less from a point of this is right, this is wrong, but rather like show me the magic of this place. And so I, started this off a couple years back with a wilderness survival training class, just like going out and transforming my relationship to nature.
Right.
Recently, I just came back from a trek out in Mount Everest and really immersing myself in that ecosystem. And I feel like it's been really rejuvenating to change the angle and direction of where this activism is coming from.
Yeah, and why did you feel that way? Like, why does it feel like duty is a burden?
So I don't know if this is like specific to environmental issues, but like to be an environmentalist is really inconvenient because it's suddenly taking like all the things that are easy and now making them more difficult. There's suddenly a bunch of rules, and by and large, because the world is designed so unsustainably, when you try to do the right thing from an environmental perspective, or you end up having to sacrifice all these things that you would otherwise want. Like, oh, I want to buy this thing, but can I? Or I want to do this thing, but should I? And so you're constantly in this dialogue of restriction. And I don't know. I mean, you have kids. I'm sure you don't let them do everything that that they want to do. But I think if you approached it from the perspective of saying like this is what needs to happen, rather like if it comes from a place of like love, would be very different than if it came from a place of like, oh, I need to like mold this kid into the best version of themselves from like a perspective of like duty. I think that the result is different, the angle is different, the feeling is different, and the burden is effectively different.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was having this conversation with my daughter last night. But not in the context of environmentalism, but in the context of taking care of our home, right? And so and the frame is really interesting. We didn't talk about it in that way, but she certainly felt that taking care of our home, whether it's things like taking clothes off the clothesline in the backyard, all those kinds of things. Is that coming from a place of duty, and then which like makes it feel like it's a burden, or does it come from a place of love, right? And we weren't talking about it with those words, but it sort of captures the spirit of our conversation in many ways, and it's true, because I think the spirit of our conversation was really more about what does care look like?
Mm-hmm.
How can we care for the things we love, right?
And where did you guys end up? Like,
we ended up with care, because this we didn't use duty, we used responsibility as the word. This feeling of being responsible, this feeling of responsibility feels like a burden. Because you feel guilty if you don't do it. It's very sort of like, and so then we started to explore this idea of care. So what does it look like to care for the things, to care for the spaces that we love so much, right? What does it look like to care for our backyard? What does it look like to care for our clothes? What does it look like to care for our food, right? All these types of things, right? So, and then you could see for her, so it shifts her headspace into, oh, this is really, it's more about care and less about, I have to do this today because it's my responsibility, right? Yeah. I want to get into, there's a bunch of really interesting things that you mentioned, from hero constructs to dialogue of restriction and so on. But I want to kind of connect some of these dots and get right into activism. And we hear the word activism a lot. It's thrown around so much these days. It's actually hard to tell what is activism and what isn't anymore. It comes about in so many different guises, from art to to public policy. And there's movements, there's resistance, there's online calling out, calling in, speaking up, speaking out. So all these kinds of things. I certainly, when I think of activism, one of the first things that pops to my mind are sort of like the great movements that were built. Movements to the dismantle the apartheid regime in South Africa. Things like that. The question I'm holding, I want to put on the table for us to dialogue on is, and we'd love to get your take on this, is what is activism for? And how would you characterize activism today?
I guess maybe I don't know if I can answer the question on it feels like such a broad topic to truly synthesize down. But I think for me, the reason I use the word activist inside, so the reason on this description right there, we got artist and activist, is because if I said I was just an artist, then art is intrinsically designed to be selfish, right? It's the expression of the artist. It's what do I want to see birthed into this world? And so it's not talking about the purpose of the art. And so the activist piece is kind of important because it's saying that the purpose of the art is to say something, is to invite change in the world in some way, shape, or form. I think that the word activist itself is actually quite polarizing because it can mean so many things. I think it intrinsically comes with a combative undertone, so much so that the word activist, if I were to go to China, I would have to make sure to not have the word activist associated with my name because I might not be able to go in, right? Because it's standing against something and it's typically seen as a disruptive force. But I think there are many forms of activism, right? You have passive activism, you have active activism, you have people who are shareholder activists, which or maybe you do tiny amounts of activism by simply the micro actions or the way you show up, the way you think. But in my case, I think the activist nature in me, I think I would subdivide into, there's the professional activism, so the direction of one's career. What is the purpose of you waking up every morning and doing the work that you do? Is the primary purpose standing up for something? Is it trying to be in service of something? Is it trying to create some level of change? I think there's an activist career, but then there's also the activism within yourself as an individual. And I almost feel that every individual today needs to figure out how to be an activist rather than to not be. And I think the reason for that is there are so many things to improve in this world. And in so many ways, what makes a life worth living is having purpose, right? Something worth fighting for. And if the alternative to that is apathy and saying oh, I'm just going to go with what is, then you're not really pursuing something that's greater than yourself. And so I think in some ways today, as we look around the world, because we can no longer hide from, we can't claim that we don't know that all the information's out there, that living to the best of our ability as an activist, not to be perfect, but rather just to have something to strive for, is how I would characterize some the modern the opportunity that we have ahead of us. Is that everyone today can be an activist in some way, shape, or form, and some choose to do it more, have it more engulfed in their lives, and others do it less. And I think maybe on that front, once again, just to bring it back down to the individual level, probably the minute every person becomes a parent is a day where they kind of become more of an activist, because suddenly they're fighting for something greater. Now they have a whole future to think about in a completely different landscape. And so maybe that's a way for everyone to feel that sense of connection and oh no, I do actually care about the way things are run, the way schools are designed, the way the healthcare system works, the environment in the future in which our kids are going to be born into. So now you suddenly start thinking a little bit more. And so I think we all are activists. We all have that right there waiting for us to just step into that power.
And, I want to come back to a couple of things that you said, but how is modern activism, in your mind, different from activism from 15 or 20 years ago? Do you see any differences?
Maybe modern was probably the wrong word. Colored through the lens of my worldview as someone who has had the privilege of having a stable family in a first world country with an education. I think like on the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there is so much privilege that I think I have been born into, that with that privilege has come a lot of optionality, and with that optionality has come the need to like improve things. I think that if you're born into a situation in which you had a lot less optionality and you were focused on survival, then activism would look very, very different. And so maybe it's more about the scale of abundance that we have today for hopefully most of the audience that is listening to this, since you're based out of Canada. I think that's more the nuance that I was trying to draw between.
And I want to just dig into that just a little bit, because when I think about activism from 25, 30, 40 years ago, a lot of the activists that some of the greats that I think of, they've really lived the suffering, so they bring their lived experience and their trauma into their activism. And is that important? And if so, how is there a way that, and I precisely ask you because you sort of said, listen, there's I come from my journey is filled with privilege. So how is there a way that you're bringing in your lived experience into your activism? And if so, how are you doing that?
I mean, so my activism, all of the installations that I create focus on like the topic of overconsumption, and so the lived experience is basically participating in a modern world economy, and realizing how wastefully designed it actually is, and being complicit in part of that entire system. And so I think for me, the activism that I am engaged in specifically is a choice, because it would be easy to turn the other way. There is actually like the suffering isn't like on me if I look the other way. Whereas I think like a lot of civil rights movements, for example, they would receive the brunt of this mistreatment, and so the lived experience of needing to stand up and represent that, I think is very different. It comes from a different place, and so mine is really coming from a place of privilege, and I think that in many ways we need a lot more people who are not suffering as a result, like immediately suffering as a result of it, to stand up, because that is sort of what the environmental activism challenges really stem from. It's not thinking about like this generation. Like I think for now everything is okay, right? Like it's when we look towards the future and future generations that environmental issues really start scaling up and becoming more problematic. And so I just think it comes from a slightly different place. And I'm not saying like one is better than the other, or one has changed differently, but they are like different in nature. And I think a lot of like when I think of the youth climate movement that is coming up, like they're not even fighting for themselves like right now. They're really projecting themselves into the future, and they're projecting themselves into what needs to happen, and the amount of work that needs to happen, and the amount of change that needs to happen. And so and maybe this is why modern day activism, so like social media activism and so forth, maybe feels a lot more performative today, because it's not like anchored and it's not as rooted in the present and the immediate and the urgent, even though it is urgent. It's just on a different scale.
Right. And given sort of social media activism and I actually want to ask you about the role of AI, generative AI in activism, because the integration of generative AI tools is it's basically integrated in all aspects of our lives now, and so given some of that, like if you really sort of like zoom out, and look at how the world is transforming, how our lives are transforming. Are there a couple of ways that you're seeing activism could evolve in the next 10 years or so?
I mean, activism is constantly evolving. I feel like
there's more privilege coming into the world, right? Like I sort of like see it. There is more folks suffering for sure, but you look at many parts of the world, generationally, this generation is sort of economically, health-wise, better off than their parents' generation or grandparents' generations. There's more privilege when you getting into the world. So that is one aspect of it, but there's a whole range of other things that are really transforming our lives, including things like generative AI. So really curious. Are there a couple of ways that activism would evolve?
I mean, I think the thing that really comes to mind is the social dynamics of activism, and the expectation, or just the way our like human psychology and our need to belong, and the tribalism that comes with it, has really shaped what activism looks like, right? So if it's almost like there are certain expectations of trends, the same way you see like a dance trend spread online. I think activism trends kind of follow the same sort of pattern, except that what it's missing is this staying power, in order to affect the change that it's really standing up for. And so I think what we see a lot in activism today is sort of like things get really reduced down to the most spreadable, the most inflammatory, the most objectable pieces of it. But then when it actually comes to do the building part is the thing that no one really seems to know how to do or how to tackle. And we've seen this happen maybe in the last decade, where we could take something like the Arab Spring, where it's we can have all this optimism around tearing down a government structure, but then when it gets rebuilt, in this new power vacuum that's formed, it's really all the people that were still at the top that are just now reforming it back to benefit themselves, right? And I think that we're seeing a little bit of that, or a lot of that, actually, like continuing. I don't know if you have this same feeling, but I feel like a lot of the narratives tend to be like, they're starting to feel repetitive. So you have like maybe some big social campaign, massive movement, petitions that get signed, a bunch of people get fired, and then everything kind of simmers down. People get distracted, it moves on, and then but the system itself hasn't changed.
Right.
So that's one thing that I worry about. I'm like, what does it look like to take all this energy and channel it from tearing things down into building them back up? And that, I think, is not necessarily something that social media or more interconnection can actually accomplish and achieve. But it's rather the opposite. It's like, where does the community gatherings of bringing people together that are sharing place and space to co-create and co-build? And I don't think anyone's really kind of solved this community piece of the puzzle, this challenge. I also think that the very nature of capitalism and the way the system is designed doesn't facilitate this kind of change and transformation, because it's not really benefiting anyone financially. So what does it look like to have those systems, or what does it look like to give activism a chance to rebuild that? I am hoping to see, though, movement. So like right now in the environmental space, there's like a movement towards regeneration as opposed to like sustainability. So this idea of like, oh, how can we build up the entire system to make sure that it can be, to make sure that the way we move on this world is a net positive to both ourselves, society, and the planet. And so I wonder if the conversation around activism, and this is something that I've tried to, that I'm actually thinking about a lot about inside of my work, is how do we actually move from fighting against things all the time into fighting for something? And that's something that I would like to see a little bit more of, but it's really hard to envision the future that we want to see. It's a lot easier to point at like what we don't like. And I think human nature is always to go kind of like the path of least resistance. We always want to go the easy route. And it's a lot harder to go the other way. And so there's this gap between, I think many people are feeling that, and maybe that's where a lot of frustration comes from, which is where this is where we are today and this is where we want to go, but we're not sure how to close that gap. So I kind of wish I have the answer in between these two places, but this is part of the tension that I'm personally thinking around. And then on the hope front, like what we're fighting for, the dangers or the caveats seem to be, how do we hold space for all the complexity and nuance in the world?
Right.
When really everyone just wants to hear like, oh, this is the way to go. This is the silver bullet solution. This is how we solve it all. But as we all know, like that never works out. And so we need to figure out how to hold space for all that complexity and nuance.
Yeah. This is really, really interesting. And I would say I'm observing very similar trends. And my sort of take, I suppose, and view on this is that, and this is where I'd love to unpack this with you. Is there is the activism of tearing things down, and there's the activism of building things up. And a lot of the activism that I've seen lately has been folks who are deeply either living an injustice or empathize with an injustice and want to create the change. And there is the activism of seeking justice, and the sort of the nuance that I'm seeing is that so much of justice seeking has become seeking better equity in the same system. It's not so much about changing the system. It's not about so I'll give you sort of a very simple example. So there's lots of folks who say, oh, we need to diversify nonprofit boards. We need more women on boards. We need more youth on boards. We need more Black folks, queer folks, etc. And so there's a lot of activism around this, to get more women on boards, get more young people on boards, etc. And so the whole idea there is to seek better equity in the same system. It's not to question Robert's rules. It's not to come up with alternate forms of governance. It's not to come up with alternate sets of principles of governance. It's none of those things, right? It's to right. So I'm really curious about is what does it look like when we have the activism of seeking equity in the same system, and the activism of building alternative models and practices and approaches in parallel. Right? And so this is sort of the your concept of fighting against and fighting for, because I'm seeing a lot of justice seekers, which is really all about seeking better equity in the same system, but not going as far as stewarding, imagining, designing alternatives. And there's other folks who perhaps may not identify or come from the world of injustice and activism and so on. There's a whole other world of building alternative models and approaches and solutions. And one of my mentors some time ago told me, Vinod, there's the environmentalism of tearing things down, and then there's the environmentalism of building things up. So where do you want to play?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the challenges of like trying to design a new system is that at the end of the day, they're always going to be really complicated. They're going to be unfamiliar. They're going to be nuanced. And there's going to be a bunch of mistakes that are made. I mean, when I look at a lot of the blockchain projects that were trying to take off, 2-3 years ago, actually a bunch of them are still going on right now. We have like blockchain really trying to get involved in the biodiversity credit space, as an example, as a really powerful tool set in order to properly account for the value of nature, and to ensure that there is a decentralized voting structure with compensation models built in. Like, there are people trying to do all these things,
right.
But they're trying to solve a really hard problem in a really new and novel way, with all the intrinsic and inherent risks of any startup, plus adding in all the bad actors, plus the fears of failure of anything else, plus people who are really just there to make money and not change the system, but just want to like look good, and so on and so forth, right? So you have all these things happening, but I think they're still happening. It's just that it's really hard to simplify, and I think that's why we hear a lot less about them. And until we really have, at the end of the day, I think society, and I'm not, once again, human nature, we always want to be the winners. We want to be on the winning team. No one's like, yeah, I want to be on the losing team, or I want to be like solidly in the middle. I want to be solidly average. And there's just almost this like how right now we have a very defined way in our head of like what a winner looks like. They usually look like wealthy, powerful, white, leading something, having a lot of agency, autonomy. But like that very structure of what winning looks like is part of the problem. And so we have both this like cultural shift that needs to happen, and then we have like the entire system change that needs to happen. And so so long as we constantly focus on measuring success based on the sort of like the same way like a country measures their GDP, right, their financial output, their production output, and we can't figure out how to measure like well-being and happiness and what is a stable family structure look like. We are really challenged in this way, and there's, once again, there's this gap between where, how we currently tell stories, the things that we're currently addicted to, the way information spreads, and what spreads today, and where we're trying to get to. That doesn't, once again, but that does not mean that it isn't happening, right? Like you're hosting these probably not viral conversations that are like long form, thought through, exploratory. It's not like a black and white saying this is the 10-step guide to solving these problems. You're exploring the nuance and the question and the complexity, and you are successfully doing that with an entire community behind you that is exploring these very questions with the humility of knowing like I don't yet know, I don't know, and so these things are happening. And I think part of what we need to remind ourselves is that these conversations are happening. They're just happening slowly, and all change that needs to happen is going to happen in this kind of like slow way until one day it becomes so obvious that it needs to change, right? Have you ever seen like Bill Moyer's movement action plan curve? I think he's like the grandfather who studies like all these social civil movements and how they happen.
Okay.
And it's like really slow S curve where like for the longest time it feels like absolutely nothing's happening, no one cares, that curve of awareness is really low, and then it hits like a tipping point, and then suddenly everyone's talking about it, and as people all start talking about it, well, public resistance to the idea equally starts to rise. And so as the activists that are on the forefront of the movement now, who've been talking about it for 10 years, are like, oh my gosh, all these idiots coming in who are like fighting it, and like we're still losing. But that awareness, even though it's that awareness, even though it's growing, feels tempered by the resistance that is rising until you hit the next tipping point, and then that you've now crossed over one bridge. Public opinion has taken over, policies start changing, and then we can move over. And so I think like the very nature of activism, like for a lot of what we're trying to do here, maybe reimagining capitalism, reimagining the very systems on which we function, we're still very, very early on in that curve. And there's all this infrastructure and questioning and building work that still needs to happen. And at those points in time, the opportunity for public activism doesn't really have a chance yet to shine. It's just kind of the same with like plastics, right? Like, so we just take plastics. It was like what the turtle, the photographs of what's his name, the birds in Midway Atoll, with their guts opened up. Like that was like one big trigger point. There was a Discovery of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. That was another like tipping point. There was also the turtle with a straw up its nose, right? That was like a really big cultural tipping point. And then suddenly within this super short time span, we now have like this global plastics treaty that's being negotiated. Whether or not it's successful, like whole nother question. But the speed at which that environmental policy, when you compare it to something like climate change, was like so much quicker and so much shorter, so much more visceral, so much because it had all this momentum, all this time to build up until it became impossible to ignore. And then public awareness was able to slam in, and then all these nonprofits that are used to moving people were just suddenly able to have like, oh, this is our super simple story, but they had an entire infrastructure of like, oh, what are we calling for, that was like ready to be there.
Right. So I think part of that I totally am aligned with. I'm also seeing that we're leaving a lot of Jevons paradox, right? And where like it was like something, ridiculous, like in the late 70s that, scientists actually connected, and with evidence, fossil fuel emissions and fossil fuel, extraction, to how climate's changing, and what's happened since, and there's been a whole bunch of dialogue, there's been a whole bunch of public policy, there's been a whole bunch of shifts in behaviors, and there's a lot of evidence for this, but globally fossil fuels consumption has actually grown. But what's interesting is that because of the introduction of these alternatives, sustainable energy, more battery technologies, and a range of things, we're actually living in the gentleman's paradox, because our consumption's actually grown on both fronts, right? We're actually consuming battery technologies at an alarming rate, and fossil fuel consumption is also growing, and not just for automobiles and so on, wherever fossil fuels are being used. Including plastics, both single-use and otherwise. So I think in many ways it also feels like this. We're living this gentleman's paradox where optionalities are keep increasing, and I don't know if that's actually a good thing. So because there's no cap on this whole idea of net zero by 2050. That's not actually, so it's not possible at this, if we want to, at the rate of overconsumption that we're in right now, right? So I think there is, like, if we wanted to have these S curves where we're actually coming out of one horizon and moving into another horizon, that we actually have to get out of one horizon, right? And so, but right now, what it feels like is we're actually straddling two horizons, because consumption of both is going up, and that's really worrying. And you can kind of draw that across a range of shifts that we're experiencing. I want to,
but there is some positivity too to think about. I mean, I think if we look at CO2 emissions per capita. Yeah. From like the 1990s to the 2020s, right. in a country like the UK, you'll see that number actually go down. It's almost halved. And so, yes, Jevons paradox means like we are.
Is that halved because most of the things that create large scale CO2 emissions, like manufacturing, have been outsourced to places like Taiwan and Philippines and China?
Yes, but even if you account for that, the average per capita is still lower. I think the lady Hannah Ritchie, who's the lead data scientist for Our World on Data, actually did a TED Talk on this very recently, and she was just saying, like, she gave this exact example that even if you accounted for all the outsourcing of manufacturing, we're still consuming slightly less. I mean, this doesn't change anything because the population is growing. We have a growing middle class. We have people that are consuming, and so the culture itself is a problem. But there are like indicators that some things are moving in the right direction. Is it fast enough? Is it are we going to achieve our goals? Like, of course not. Like, totally agree with you. But there are like little like sparks of positivity that are.
Of course. And I'm not saying like we still have to deal with, yes, like what we're the sort of the, even if you just sort of like look at sort of transport as one example, and that just that one shift of going from extract and burn, which is what we've been doing for many decades, to battery technology and electrification. Yes, not perfect. Yes, it's still extracting things, but the ability to recycle is higher. The ability to be able to pull apart metals, pull them back together is higher. It's not a constant extract and burn, and it's not a perfect solution, but markedly better than where we were. And like there's sometimes that there's this notion of, well, like it's not the perfect solution because we're still extracting. We need to still extract. But if we don't actually move to that, then like unless we come up with a solution where we can live and do the thing that we're doing, without material use, like what it boils down to today, is everything that we use,
Consumes energy.
is either grown or mined, like
Yeah.
full stop, right? I want to, I want to switch gears just a little bit because it's kind of conscious of time, and there's a couple of things I want to really get to because you talked about polarizing, and I want to talk about polarization and activism because the Edelman Trust Barometer says that the world is becoming more polarized. What they mean by that is people are, hold stronger and stronger sort of binary views on issues, and feel that their country is deeply divided along these issues. And perhaps more importantly, that these views are entrenched, and that people don't feel that these divisions can be overcome. And I've been wondering about how activism plays into this. Is activism actually fueling division? What do you think?
I think it is. uh, because the nature of activists, I mean, the playbook of activism is to take something complex, to simplify it down to its most, I guess, easy to understand, emotional, resonant bit, and then trigger someone to take an action, right? Like you're trying to reduce everything. And so, and now if you add the social dimension of this, of saying, oh, well, if you don't like silence is violence or whatever, you add all these different pieces to it. Now you're creating these mobs, these frenzied mobs who hold very strong beliefs to say like, this is the way, this is why, this is the way, this is why. And the people who do that successfully get rewarded. They get elevated, they get lifted to the top, they get amplified, they get invited to conferences because now they're the face of this movement or whatever it happens to be. And so there's almost like and if you have doubts, if you have questions, if you're unsure of something, well, now you're not getting invited to talk or speak on a stage because that's not the person that's leading the rally who's saying like, you know what, it's a little more complicated. You need the people who are are radicals, because they're the ones that are able to rile people up, right? That's what we're looking for as an emotional experience. So I do worry about that. Maybe one, and I don't know if this is a bright spot, but just somewhat of an observation, is that I feel like with many things, if you look at the U.S., because I'm a little more familiar with that, things used to be very divided, like or it felt like things were simple, where like liberals would lean one way and Republicans would lean another way on very specific issues. But I feel like that's kind of fragmenting. So if we took like the environmental movement right now, and which may be very united on issues like climate or plastics. But now if you add a layer of like war in Gaza on top of this, you've now fragmented that entire group so much so that in environmental conferences, I feel like that at least the ones that I've been to recently, like you don't even touch that topic with a 10-foot pole because there's zero to be gained to like voice your opinion on this issue because you're going to have half the people who like you and half the people who don't like you. So we could take that issue, but then we could take other issues because of the increased tribalism that's going on. You're like kind of refragmenting your group. So your single group has now broken into two. But if you add another layer, which could be anything from spirituality to vaccines or whatever, another thing, now you'll further fragment people. And so if you keep applying this like super tribalism and you keep fragmenting groups down,
superimpose those layers
layers, then eventually you're going to reach a point where now, let's say you and me have a different one. We agree on a bunch of things, but we disagree on a couple of things. Hopefully we have enough things that we really strongly agree on that we can now approach these topics to now have a conversation again. So I'm kind of wondering what happens when we start superimposing all these, like there's only so many ways we can fragment it until eventually we're like, well, we can't, everything can't be black and white, right? Like, so the hope is that we eventually just move towards an understanding that the world is gray. And I think when we look at popular culture as maybe an indicator, I personally think it's really cool to see shows like Game of Thrones pop out where right and wrong is not so clear cut. We'll see this in like Avengers Civil War, another thing where like presumably you have all these good guys, but they disagree with the way good is meant to unfold. And so they have to find these compromises. And I think we're starting to see that reflected in a lot of these like hero narratives that used to be good versus evil. Those are becoming really boring. And we're starting to see like, oh, what happens when we disagree with our friends, our families, and we start seeing the fraying of our relationships. And so I feel like this is very much top of mind on the zeitgeist of conversations, despite all the posturing, right? So and you'll see a difference. I think I don't know if you've had this experience where you'll talk to someone who is really opinionated online, but then you might have a dinner conversation with them and actually realize there's like all these layers of nuance underneath it that on a one-on-one in a closed room in an environment of safety and trust, like we can still have those discussions. So I wonder how that's going to play itself out over time.
Yeah, and I think it's a really, really interesting point. And I was at an environmental conference recently, and you could tell there were Indigenous environmental activists, there were non-Indigenous environmental activists, and they agreed on a bunch of things. One thing they didn't agree on was veganism as a solution. Right? Like to give it some, and there were some very heated debates, very strong opinions about veganism, and so again, sort of like the layers of complexity and nuance, and what is the sort of the fragmentation that we can, and that's just like one small example, right? So and the thing that I found really, really interesting is how in those types of situations, how guilt can be used as a driver. And I want to get into this as sort of perhaps a last point that we explore before we pause, and hopefully we'll have get to have a part 2 of this. Last time we spoke, we got into a really fascinating discussion on authentic progress in society, and you had sort of articulated this this idea of, we got into it a little bit. I'd love to get into it a bit more, but this idea of creativity motivated progress versus guilt motivated progress. And it in many ways feels like to me that we're in the era of guilt motivated progress. And I'd love for you to unpack that a little bit. I certainly don't feel inspired by guilt motivated progress. As a species, we're in the middle of a number of big transitions, and I'd like everybody to celebrate and be proud of the big transitions as we're sort of like going through them. But if guilt is the primary motivator, like, how helpful is that? Like, is guilt one of the tools of activism, and is guilt as a tool helpful?
I mean, I think this brings us really back to the earlier conversation, right? This this nuance between duty and love, this idea of care. I mean, as a parent, you probably don't say, "Oh, I did a bad job last time, so I should do a better job this time." It's hopefully something that's a little bit more, I will always try to do the best that I possibly can, given the circumstances and the best of my ability. That's I think how we want to show up in the world. But as far as like effective messaging goes, it's a lot more because the human species as a group of people who like to procrastinate or who need to be motivated to do something because otherwise status quo is too easy, because society has designed life to be as easy, as frictionless, as convenient as possible, and that convenience and luxury is actually antithetical to a lot of the values that we hold. I think that's sort of the really big friction that we're seeing, is that the system is not designed for us to do the right thing. The easy thing, more often than not, is the wrong thing. The cheapest thing is the wrong thing because it hasn't taken into account all the costs of all the externalities. You started off this conversation with a lengthy introduction of the land that you're on. That was the work that you needed to articulate and put into place to slow down the flow of the podcast. But there's a reason why that you reintroduced friction into the conversation. And so I think that the guilt piece works really well because it's because it's something that we all carry within us. Is very easy to call out. and it's a lot harder to do the reverse. So where does that leave us, or what do we need to work towards? I mean, if we touch upon, I'm trying to bringing all the conversation topics. If we go back to this veganism idea,
Yeah.
I'm vegan, and I think there are many different ways of trying to get the vegan message out there, and it's hard to say like whether there's a right way or wrong way. There are the folks that are just going to like throw a bunch of like factory farming images at you and just hammer you on the head, and
Right.
to a certain extent they serve a purpose. But I've always felt that like the kind of vegan that you want to be is the kind of vegan that people want to hang out with, that you can like sit around on a campfire and say like, oh, come over here, like it's warm, it's nice, let's have a conversation about it. But we don't need to agree. I don't need to tell you what's right or wrong. But like if you want to have the conversation, let's have a conversation. And so this idea of activism and I think striking the balance that we kind of need to do as we look forward is figuring out how can we both express the urgency of what needs to happen and make it a fun and cool and exciting place and movement to be a part of. And what I think we are lacking are the dreamers and the visionaries to imagine this world that we could be possibly working towards. And I think that it's because it's really hard to articulate what that world actually looks like, what it feels like. And so as we shift towards a world today that I think we are looking for a lot more experiences instead of stuff, I think as we start coming up with new ways of experiences that allow us to feel a certain way and say like, this is how the world could be, these little sort of prototypical eco villages or micro societies that are sort of starting to coalesce. I don't know if they're fully possible because they seem to like always go as like, in order to reimagine what society looks like, you're going in the middle of nowhere to reimagine what that society looks like, as opposed to like the next step. There's like a big gap, but I do feel that we're starting to hopefully introduce the ideas of how, at the very least, how we want to feel together as we work towards the places that we're trying to evolve into. And so where can we find those spaces, those experiences, and so forth in order to shift that center?
I got a quick follow up on guilt, and then I want to wrap up here. Where is guilt unhelpful?
I mean, if we took the human experience and had the the shadow side, I guess we just drop everything in there. So if it's preventing you from thinking critically, if it's keeping you from taking action, if it's causing you to turn away, I think there's an entire, if it's causing you to be blindsided, to become more impatient, to be angry, basically all the shadow sides of human characteristics. But the funny thing is that it's the same call to action, the same message, the same movie could trigger very different feelings in people. Right? There's the way the message is put out there and the way it's received. And so there's a responsibility of both the activist who's shaping the message, but also responsibility on the person who's receiving the information to say like, to not immediately jump to a conclusion and to try to parse things out. So I think we have kind of like two ways of looking at it.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Hopefully we'll get a bit more into this next time. I want to wrap up with this question because I've seen your art installations and they're absolutely captivating. But I want to ask you a question. Are you imagining art projects, art installations that are not about fighting against things, but about fighting for things?
I'm trying to make that shift right now. So the bulk of the art installations that I've done have highlighted the magnitude and the scope of the problem. The one that I just had in Ottawa was a giant plastic tap spewing plastics all over the environment. It was like 3 stories tall. So really large installation showing what we need to fix. I'm actually right now headed to the United Nations Biodiversity Conference in Colombia, in Cali. And I managed to secure a spot on the Blue Zone to create another 2-story tall art installation. This time it's going to be a biodiversity Jenga. where each and every block represents a unique and different ecosystem. But this Jenga tower is looking fragile, but hopefully really beautiful. And so you have this sort of nuance between where we are now, but what we need to do in order to stabilize ourselves before we hit these tipping points. So that one's maybe like a little bit more neutral, right? Like it's showcasing both the beauty, but also the hope and the possibility. The tower hasn't collapsed, the tower isn't falling over. We still have time. And then I'm also trying to like start playing around in the space of innovations, nature-based solutions. So last year I built a giant 6-meter tall phoenix made out of 4 tons of biochar. Biochar is responsible for 89% of verified carbon removal credits. It's a decentralized technology that works across various income levels. That's originally an indigenous technology. And this one shows like a phoenix rising from the ground, capturing essentially the average person's carbon footprint. And so that one, I think, still really large installation highlighting the problem in some ways, but also the solution that we have to address it. And so I'm trying to start divesting away from just focusing on what's wrong with the world and focusing on like what's potentially right and what we can do about it. And I will say it's a lot harder to do. It is a lot harder to do, and it's a lot harder to do that in a way that that also doesn't try to point, for example, a biochar piece. Like you don't want to say that biochar is the solution. It isn't the solution. It's just one piece of the solution.
Right.
But if anyone has ideas or things to tackle, if you have any ideas, I mean, I would love to continue this conversation because for me, when I think about the role of art installations and the power of these visual monuments, I do think that when we think of the most famous monument of them all, like the Statue of Liberty, it's taking an abstract concept like freedom and democracy and it's simplifying it down so much so that at the end of the day now, with a single like satirical comic, you can express a very complex idea of how we may be failing at upholding the ideas of freedom and democracy. And I think with environmental movements and social movements broadly, we do need to have these common visual milestones and anchors where we can like look back to and say like, oh, this is what's going on. And so when I think of something like the Clean Water Act getting repealed, I wonder how different that conversation might be if everyone had a visual monument associated to that in their mind, so that when it was repealed or when it was under threat, people could have talked about it in a far more easy and compelling way. But like, because there's only abstraction to sit upon, there's no ease of organizing around it. Like there's nothing, it kind of just like falls through your fingers like quicksand in a very like media saturated world. And so what I'm hoping to do as I look around the landscape is to create these visual anchors. And obviously I can't control the success of these symbols, but at least to position myself in a way where I can create these moments that can hopefully create some kind of glue, social or cultural glue that people can kind of glom onto so that they can expand the conversation. I just want to create that starting point.
Right. Yeah. Phenomenal. Ben, thank you so much for sharing your time and energy and presence and perspectives with us. I'm really excited for continuing the conversation, and we'll reach out on that. But this is phenomenal and super enriching, and hope it was for you too.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having me.